We will now extend our knowledge of equilibrium systems into acid and base. Before talking about acid and base, however, it's important to review some terminologies. As we recall from earlier courses, solutions of ionic compounds tend to produce ions because they dissociate, and these ions in solutions will conduct electricity, so we call these ionic compounds electrolytes. On the other hand, molecular compounds exist as discrete compounds. They do not dissociate when dissolved in water. They retain their discrete structures. So when we write for the solution of sucrose, we just change the subscript from a solid into aqueous. Similarly, for methanol, we go from liquid methanol into aqueous methanol. Now let's talk about acids. Traditionally, in courses such as Science 10, we define acids as materials that turn blue limits red. They can neutralize base, and they react with metals to produce hydrogen gas. However, we should note that some compounds, mostly gases, such as carbon dioxide, can only exist as an acid when dissolved in water. When dissolved in water, become aqueous carbon dioxide, which then further reacts with water to produce carbonic acid. Let's quickly review the properties of acids and bases. Acids, remember, are electrolytes, which means their solutions, their aqueous solutions, can conduct electricity. They turn blue limits red, they taste sour, they react with metals such as zinc and magnesium to produce hydrogen gas, and lastly they neutralize bases. On the other hand, bases are also electrolytes, but they turn red limits blue, they taste bitter, they feel slippery, they neutralize acids. And also we should note that bases can be ionic for things like sodium hydroxide, or it could be molecular for things like ammonia. Now that we've reviewed the properties of acids and bases, let us go over the definition of acids and bases. You'll remember from earlier courses, an acid is a species which ionizes, not dissociates, into hydrogen ions and its negative ions. On the other hand, bases is a species which dissociates into hydroxide ions. So some simple examples are nitric acid and lithium hydroxide. Nitric acid ionizes into hydrogen ions and nitrate ion, and whereas lithium hydroxide dissociates into lithium ion and hydroxide ions. However, for some species, it requires the reaction of water before it can ionize to produce hydrogen ions or dissociate to produce hydroxide ions, and these are called the modified Arrhenius definitions. In previous courses, we also talked about the concept of hydronium ions. When something ionizes into the hydrogen ion, H+, that hydrogen ion quickly gets attracted to a water molecule through hydrogen bonding to form what is called a hydronium ion. That is, you'll rarely find a free-floating hydrogen plus ion in an aqueous solution. So therefore, it is more technically correct to refer to an acid as a solution of H3O+, or hydronium ions. As previously mentioned, a modified Arrhenius theory is an acid that has to react with water. However, now that we've remembered about the hydronium ion, we can define an acid as something that reacts with water to increase the hydronium concentration, whereas a base is something that reacts with water to increase the hydroxide concentration. However, a drawback of the modified Arrhenius definition is that it can only explain acid-base properties, but it cannot predict them. For example, when you have a solution of bicarbonate ion reacting with water, are you more likely to produce a solution of hydroxide ions, or are you more likely to produce a solution of hydronium ions? In order to find out, we have to go into the lab and test it empirically. We can easily do this using a litmus test, and we find that hydrogen carbonate is actually a basic compound. We can further expand acid-base theory into what's called the Bronsted-Lowry definition. This was produced in 1923 independently by Bronsted and Lowry. It says that an acid is a species that donates a proton, or H+, whereas a base is a species that accepts a proton. And that an acid-base reaction occurs when a proton is transferred from the acid to a base. The example here we have hydrogen sulfate reacting with cyanide to produce sulfate ion and cyanic acid. Here, because the hydrogen, the H+, is transferred from hydrogen sulfate into cyanide, we'll call this hydrogen sulfate as the acid, whereas the cyanide, the species that accepts the proton, as the base. We now also have two new definitions. When an acid loses a hydrogen, it becomes a base, because in the reverse reaction, if there was one, we could see the transfer of the hydrogen from cyanic acid onto sulfate to produce hydrogen sulfate. So therefore, let's see. In our forward reaction, the acid now becomes a base. We call this actually the conjugate base because it is the opposite base of an acid. Conversely, in our forward reaction, the base now becomes the conjugate acid. So it's important to remember, in our forward reaction, an acid becomes a conjugate base, and the base becomes a conjugate acid. Using our new Bronsted-Lowry definition, we can explain how something like sodium carbonate can be used to neutralize both acids and base. In fact, sodium carbonate can be considered to be an amphoteric substance. An amphoteric substance is something that has the ability to react either as an acid or a base. A similar term is amphiprotic. It is an ion or molecule that can either accept a hydrogen acting as a base, or it can donate a hydrogen acting as an acid. Here we see we have our bicarbonate ion. If it were to accept accept a hydrogen from a strong acid, such as hydronium, it will raise the pH of the strong acid solution. On the other hand, hydrogen carbonate can also donate one of its hydrogen onto hydroxide to produce water. This will have the effect of lowering the pH of the strong base solution. In addition to hydrogen carbonate, other molecules such as hydrogen sulfate or hydrogen phosphate can also react as an amphiprotic molecule. It can either donate protons or it can accept protons. Our Bronsted-Lowry definition of an acid is a better definition of an acid and base reaction because now it allows us to explain why the reaction between a weak base and a weak acid is fast, because only a hydrogen is transferred. As well, our Bronsted-Lowry definition of an acid also allows us to explain non-aqueous reaction. Here we see you have hydrogen chloride gas reacting with ammonia gas. This is happening in a gaseous atmosphere. Here, the HCl donates a proton to ammonia, and now it forms the ionic compound ammonium chloride. Another definitions that we have to deal with is what is called a polyprotic acid and a polyprotic base. A polyprotic acid is any acid that can lose more than one hydrogen, and a polyprotic base is a base that can accept more than one hydrogen. And lastly, the term organic acid refers to any organic compound. Again, an organic compound is a compound with carbons, hydrogens, and or oxygens. And these organic compounds have acidic property. Usually, it is due to the presence of the carboxylic acid group, which again is C, double bond O, single bond OH. And it is only this H here that is the acidic hydrogen. These are usually weak acids and do not dissociate completely. A conjugate acid-base pair, as we mentioned earlier, is the opposite acid or base in the reverse reaction. In this case, we have acetic acid being as an acid because it has an acidic hydrogen. When it reacts with water, it becomes acetate. Acetate here is the conjugate base. On the other hand, our base in our forward reaction, our water, once it gains a hydrogen to become hydronium, now becomes the conjugate acid. So a conjugate acid-base pair is any two substances with a formula that differs only by the presence of a hydrogen. So once again, a conjugate acid-base pair is present in any acid-base reaction. And these conjugate acid-base pairs, further, are found opposite of each other in your table of acids and bases. Again, if we look at our example closely, acetic acid is the acid. The conjugate base of acetic acid is acetate. Water is our base, and a conjugate acid of water is hydronium. There will always be two conjugate acid-base pair in any acid-base reactions. Lastly, conjugate acid-base pairs appears opposite each other on your acid and base table. A couple of review definitions. A strong acid tends to ionize relatively easily. That is, it has a very weak attraction for its proton. On the other hand, a strong base has a strong affinity, strong attraction for protons. We can extend this generalization into conjugate acid-base pairs. The stronger an acid, the weaker its conjugate base, and the opposite, the weaker an acid, the stronger its conjugate base. While the Bronsted-Lowry definition of an acid-base reaction allows us to define reactions that are non-aqueous, we can now talk about gaseous reactions. It does not, however, predict why a proton is transferred, or can it not predict when a reaction will occur for any two acid-base pairs. We will look at predicting whether or not an acid-base pair will react in a future video.